Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. So, last time we were looking at utilitarianism and some of the advantages of the view. Well, this week we're going to start looking at some of the problems or worries that have been raised. In this video, we'll look at a question about whether or not utilitarianism sort of sets the standards of morality too high. So, we'll have a brief review of consequentialism and utilitarianism. Then we'll talk about this worry that maybe utilitarianism is too demanding. It sort of sets the standards sort of unrealistically high. We'll talk about the ought implies can principle. We'll talk about, does utilitarianism require humanly impossible calculations? Does utilitarianism require humanly impossible motivations? We'll talk about decision procedures versus standards of rightness. Then we'll talk about utilitarianism and supererogation. So consequentialism, remember, this is a moral theory that says an action is morally required just because it produces the best overall results. Now, one influential and simple version of the theory, as we mentioned, was act utilitarianism. So this is a theory that tells you about which results would be the best results. An action is morally required if and only if it does more to improve overall well-being than any other action you could have done in the circumstances. So now, utilitarianism, at least as traditionally conceived here, seems to set the standards for moral behavior quite high. So you're always morally obligated to perform the action that leads to the best overall results compared to any other action that was available to you. Well, good results here are not good enough. Only the best will do. If you fall short of the best overall results, you've done something morally wrong. Now, many worry that this is too demanding. We're sort of setting the bar unrealistically high. So, is this true? Does utilitarianism set the standards for moral behavior too high? And there's a variety of ways that this objection might be developed. Now, one thing I want to stress here is that this is a bit interesting because one of the things utilitarians have often said in their favor is that their theory seems to be a morality that is sort of suited for the real world. The idea is, remember, that moral flexibility. The idea is we need that flexibility in order to respond to the demands of living in an imperfect world. And so they thought the morality that gives you that flexibility to make sort of the best out of a bad situation is one that is more suited for the real world. But now we're seeing here, well, maybe in some sense it's also unrealistic in setting the demands too high and saying that you have to make the best sort of option available. All right, so utilitarians often respond that maybe morality is demanding. I mean, it can be hard to do the right thing. Morality isn't easy, and no human being is always moral. Nobody's morally perfect. And so we shouldn't think that people are always going to live up to the demands of morality. Nonetheless, it's important to know where the ideal is so that we know when we fail to meet our moral obligation, and we can thereby strive to improve to get closer to that ideal. So that's one way that a sort of utilitarian might respond to these kinds of worries. However, most ethicists, including utilitarians, have agreed, not all, but have agreed that a theory of moral obligations must meet the following constraint. It's what's sometimes called the ought implies can principle. The idea is, if it's true that a person morally ought to do some action, A, then it must be possible for that person to do the action. And I can sort of reverse this to say, if it's not possible for someone to do an action, then we can't say that they are morally obligated to do it. So, for instance, imagine that someone holds me up at gunpoint and says that they will kill my entire family unless I jump up and fly around like Superman. Well, obviously, I'm not going to do that. But when I don't, imagine that they make good on their promise and they kill my whole family. Now, nobody could rightfully demand and say, Sam, you did something morally wrong. You can't say that morality required that I jumped up and flew around like Superman to save my family's life, because that's just physically impossible. I would have to defy the laws of gravity, and that's impossible for me to do. All right. Similarly, imagine someone's drowning halfway around the world at this very moment. Now, obviously, it'd be better if I were to save them from drowning. That would be a better sort of consequence. But morality can't demand. You can't say that I did anything wrong by not sort of jumping in and sort of pulling that person out of there, because that wasn't an option. It's impossible for me to do so. I can't travel halfway around the world in a second. So the basic idea here of ought implies can is morality cannot demand that we do the impossible. When we say that someone is obligated to do something, it must be the case that they have the ability to do that thing. All right. And now here we come in, and some people want to say, well, it looks as if maybe utilitarianism does demand the impossible from humans. So many people object that utilitarianism seems to place impossible demands on human beings to constantly be performing calculations and weighing the short and long-term consequences of their actions every time they decide to do something. Unfortunately, the worry is that we're just not computers, and we don't have the ability to perform such complex calculations every time we do something. So we can turn this into an argument. Let's call it the calculation argument. If utilitarianism is true, then we ought to make complex calculations about the consequences of our action whenever we make a decision. If we ought to make complex calculations about consequences of our actions before any decision, then we have the ability to do this. So this second premise is the ought implies can principle. But then the idea here is we just don't have that ability. Thus, utilitarianism is false, since it's making impossible demands of us. A similar objection is that utilitarianism places impossible demands not on our calculations, but on our motivations. The idea is that human beings are always constantly striving and motivated by a goal to produce the best overall results for every person's well-being, including complete strangers. Looks as if maybe utilitarianism demands that kind of motivation. Unfortunately, we're not saints. Human nature is largely selfish. Now, we can try to overcome, we can care about a number of people, we can show empathy, but the idea is maybe it's impossible for us to ever completely act entirely and always from altruistic motives. We just can't go against our very nature. Sometimes that selfishness is going to come in. All right, so we can turn this into what we'll call the motivations argument. The idea is, if utilitarianism is true, then we ought to always have altruistic motivations. If we ought to always have altruistic motivations, then we have that ability. That's the ought implies can. But we don't have the ability to always act on altruistic motivations, since, again, that would just go entirely against human nature, and we can't defy human nature. Yet again, we can try to become more altruistic than we are. We can sort of strive to be the best we can, but it's impossible for us to ever get rid of our selfishness entirely, someone might think. Thus, utilitarianism is false. All right. So in order to understand how a utilitarian is going to reply to these objections, we need to distinguish between two ideas in ethics. There's the idea of a decision procedure and the idea of a standard of rightness. So a decision procedure is a procedure we can use for making our decisions that, when used, it will reliably lead us to making the decisions that we ought to. So the idea here is that a decision procedure doesn't define morality. It doesn't define what our moral obligations are. Rather, it's sort of a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb that can help us make a decision that's more likely to live up to whatever the standards of morality are. But a standard of rightness is a standard that provides the necessary and sufficient conditions for an action being morally right. So this is what defines morally right and wrong action. Utilitarianism is a standard of rightness. It is not proposed as a decision procedure. An action being optimific is the standard that determines or defines whether an action is morally right or wrong. However, that doesn't mean we should always make decisions by asking whether an action we're thinking of performing is optimific before we do it. Making decisions in that way might actually undermine the utilitarian goal by leading us to make non-optimific choices. The idea here is, look, sometimes we're rushed for time. And if we sat there calculating all the consequences, we just don't have enough time to do that. And so by the time we got done, we would have missed our opportunity for action. And thus, if we spend all that time making those calculations, we'll actually end up making the world worse. But the whole point of sort of utilitarianism is that the right thing to do is whatever leads to the best consequences. All right. Now, sometimes doing calculations will be helpful for leading us to make optimistic choices. And sometimes it'll get in the way of our making optimistic choices. Sometimes we just might be bad at calculating the consequence. Sometimes we just might not have enough time. But other times, maybe we do have a little bit of time, and maybe the choices are important where sort of thinking about it would maybe do better than maybe going with our gut. I mean, so for instance, look, if I'm walking by a beach and I see a little kid sort of drowning, I mean, I think I should probably act on instinct. I'm more likely to do the right thing. If I sat there and thought, okay, well, I could go to the lifeguard, I could sort of see if anybody else is around, I could sort of save them and just sort of jump in, but if I do, well, then I'll have to get, my clothes will be ruined. What are the chances that that kid is the next Hitler? The idea is, look, by the time I get done going through all those sort of ideas in my head, I'll have missed my chance to save the kid, and thus I'll have, by making my decision in that way, I'll actually have led myself to do something that leads to worse overall consequences. So that is, I'm more likely to do the optimistic action by acting on instinct in that situation. But in other situations, so for instance, if a president's deciding to sort of declare war or not, you want to know what? I don't think they should go with their gut. I think maybe they should take some time to actually think about what the consequences of that action might be. Because I think that's more likely to lead them to do sort of produce better consequences. And so I think in that situation, it'd be better overall for them to take the time and make a decision by thinking through the calculations. Now, the end goal that sets the standard for morally right actions on utilitarianism is maximizing overall happiness. So if making a decision by running through the calculations will help us make the optimistic decision, well then we should do the calculations in that situation. But if doing calculations hinders that goal, well then we shouldn't do the calculations. We should make our decision in a way that's more likely to lead us to do the thing that's going to produce more overall good. Like I said, utilitarianism is not telling us how to make decisions. It's telling us what makes actions right or wrong. So when those decisions would be right or wrong. So when we look at the calculation argument and the motivation argument, again, the utilitarian is going to deny the first premise of each. They're going to say, look, if utilitarianism is true, then it's not necessarily the case that we ought to make complex calculations for all our decisions. Because all they say is the action should lead to the optimistic results. And sometimes doing those calculations are going to stop you from doing the action that leads to the best overall results. Similarly with motivations. If utilitarianism is true, that doesn't imply that you ought to always have altruistic motivations. Utilitarianism says your motivations don't matter. What matters is your action and whether or not that produces the best overall results. If acting out of love for your child is what leads you to do the optimistic action, the utilitarian will say, well, you did the right thing. And sometimes people might even do the right thing for the wrong reasons. So John Stuart Mill famously said, look, if someone saves a drowning person, they did the right thing, whether they did it because of empathy for that person or they did it hoping for a reward. The person who did it hoping for a reward still did what they ought to have done. They still did the morally right thing. They just did it for the wrong reasons. Utilitarianism is not a theory about what the right motivations are. It's about what the morally right actions are. All right, nonetheless, you might be worried that utilitarianism is still too demanding because it still does require the action to lead to the best overall results. Your book puts it this way: even if we needn't always deliberate with an eye to doing what's optimistic, and even if we needn't always have a saint's motivation, we really must act so as to achieve optimistic results. So this much is clearly true about utilitarianism. Whenever we fail, we are behaving immorally. It appears that a consistently utilitarian lifestyle would be one of great and constant self-sacrifice. Anytime you can do more good for others than you can for yourself, you're morally required to do so. So I added the morally there just to make sure people understand you're not necessarily legally required. I mean, it might be bad to legally require things to do people to do these things, but the idea is you're still morally required to do so. If you're like most readers of the book, in no danger of starvation, able to afford a night out, a new pair of jeans, a vacation every so often, then utilitarianism calls on you to do a great deal more for others than you're probably doing. So for instance, maybe you buy, how much do you spend on coffee each month? How much do you spend on going out to sort of movies or going out to fast food each month? Think you could have stayed home, ate cheaper food, saved that money, and donated it to a charity that could have maybe literally saved a person's life. With regard to whether or not you have maybe a slightly more convenience for eating out, that like even if you get some pleasure out of that, surely someone's life is more valuable. You could have done more good by donating that money. Now, the worry here is that utilitarianism makes no room for the concept of what's called supererogation. When an action goes above and beyond what one is morally obligated to do. So this would be a case where an action is morally admirable and praiseworthy, but not morally required. All right. This leads to what we can call the supererogation argument. So if utilitarianism is true, then there are no supererogatory actions. But there are supererogatory actions. There are some actions that we think go above and beyond. So yet again, if sort of doing more good requires you to literally sort of sacrifice your own life, we might praise someone, we might think it's admirable for someone to do so, but we don't necessarily think that they're morally required to do so, to make that sacrifice. Or maybe someone who sacrifices, so they spend all their time away from their family, a doctor spends all their time away from their family so that they can treat more sort of patients and save more lives maybe in sort of rural Haiti. I have an actual example in mind here. That might be a really good thing to do, a sort of selfless thing to do, but we often think that that person's going above and beyond what's required. But the idea is, thus utilitarianism is false. Because notice, utilitarianism, there is no such thing as going above and beyond the call of duty because you can't do better than the best consequences. All right. There are some potential replies that a utilitarian might give, though. A utilitarian might argue that morality is more demanding than people ordinarily think. Notice, conventional morality is fallible. We ordinarily think that a lot of these things are optional extras, but maybe our ordinary thinking is just wrong. We shouldn't assume that all our moral beliefs can withstand rational scrutiny. So Peter Singer has famously argued that a lot of the things we think of as sort of charity, as sort of morally optional but good, are actually morally required. And that when we sort of rationally think about the situation, we can't sort of justify our attitude of thinking of these as morally optional. Now, it may still be helpful to clearly recognize the ways we fall short, even if we shouldn't blame ordinary persons for failing to live a morally perfect life. So that is, look, even if utilitarianism requires us to do these things and people oftentimes fall short of it, we shouldn't necessarily blame them because, yet again, nobody's perfect. And it might not do any good to sort of really blame anybody. It might just sort of cause resentment and then lead to people not sort of doing anything to help others. And so maybe we shouldn't blame them, but it still might be important to sort of at least clear-eyed recognize that we are falling short so that we can aim to maybe do better. Now, a utilitarian could also adjust the theory and adopt what's sometimes called a satisficing rather than a maximizing form of consequentialism. So on these kinds of views, they say, look, yes, morality is about the results of your actions. But on these views, morality doesn't require you to maximize the overall good, but rather you just need to sort of meet some sort of threshold of overall good. You need to do enough overall good compared to the other actions available. And so you need to sort of satisfy some threshold. So you meet sort of that bar, but you don't have to sort of maximize those consequences. One worry for that, though, is where do you set the threshold? How good is good enough? Where do your moral obligations sort of stop? It's not clear that there's a clear line between what's morally required and what's morally optional, or how we would even set that threshold. But that is an option that people are investigating today. Anyways, that's all for our video. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.